The rhythm of life on the farm was predictable, steady, just the way I liked it. I spent my days feeding the animals, repairing equipment, and tending to the fields. The isolation was comforting, a kind of peaceful silence that let me work without interruption. On a typical day, it was just me, the animals, and the open land stretching out beyond the horizon. I was used to being alone, but I wasn't lonely. There was something satisfying about a life measured in tasks completed. The fence mended, the hay stacked, the chickens fed. The nearest town was miles away and visitors were rare. That was how I liked it. Life was simple and trouble felt like something that belonged to other people, in other places. Then one morning, I noticed something strange. As I was out near the barn, working on the tractor, I saw a car driving slowly down the road past my house. It was unusual. People rarely came this far out unless they had business, and this car didn't look like it belonged to anyone from around here. I paused for a moment, wiping my hands on my jeans, watching as the car crawled by and disappeared down the road. I didn't think much of it at the time. Probably someone lost, I figured, or just curious about the farm. I shrugged it off and got back to work. The next morning, I was back out in the yard, fixing a sagging fence post, when I noticed the same car again. Same time, same slow crawl past my house. I stopped what I was doing and watched it until it disappeared down the road. It was starting to feel odd. Not many people came out here by chance, and even fewer came twice. But I told myself there was no harm in it. Maybe it was a tourist taking in the scenery, or someone visiting family in the area. I tried to push it out of my mind and get back to work, but the thought lingered, a small itch at the back of my brain. When the car passed by again the next day, it felt different, intentional, as if whoever was driving wasn't just passing through, they were watching. My skin prickled as I stood there, tools hanging forgotten from my hands, watching the car until it disappeared around the bend. I couldn't explain it, but something about the whole thing made me uneasy. Still, what could I do? It was just a car. I went back to my chores, hoping the strange routine wouldn't continue. It was the fourth day when the car stopped. I was near the barn, filling a bucket with feed for the chickens, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. I looked up to see the same car, a dark sedan, idling at the edge of the property. A woman got out, dressed neatly in a plain coat, and started walking toward me. There was nothing outwardly threatening about her. She was middle-aged with a polite smile, the kind of person you might see at a grocery store checkout. But something about the way she carried herself made me wary. "Good morning," she called out cheerfully as she approached, her voice carrying across the yard. I set the bucket down, wiping my hands on my jeans as she stopped a few feet away. She started asking questions. Simple ones at first. Did I live here alone? How long had I been on the farm? Did I get many visitors? The questions felt casual, but there was something too precise about them, as if she were working through a list. Then came the one that made my stomach tighten. "Do you keep any dogs?" I hesitated, my mind racing. "Not right now," I answered carefully, trying not to sound suspicious. She gave a small nod, as if that was the answer she expected. The conversation ended quickly after that. She thanked me for my time and walked back to her car, leaving me standing by the barn, a nagging sense of unease settling over me. I watched as the car drove away, kicking up dust along the gravel road and disappeared over the hill. For the next few days, the car didn't return. I tried to push the strange encounter from my mind, telling myself it was probably nothing. Maybe she was a surveyor, or someone new to the area looking to meet people. I clung to those explanations, trying to convince myself I had nothing to worry about. Life went back to normal, or at least, it tried to. I threw myself into work, repairing fences, tending the animals, doing everything I could to keep my mind occupied. The quiet of the farm, usually so comforting, began to feel heavy, as if the silence was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Just as I was starting to believe the strange visit was behind me, the car returned. This time, it pulled up to the edge of the property as the sky was darkening, the sun dipping low behind the hills. I was inside the house, looking out the front window, when I saw it. Two men stepped out of the car. One of them was tall, with broad shoulders, and the other was lean and wiry. As they started walking toward the house, I noticed something glinting in the tall man's hand, a gun. my instinct took over. I turned away from the window, moving quickly toward the basement door. I locked it behind me, heart pounding, and grabbed my phone from the shelf near the stairs. With shaking hands, I dialed the police. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could hear the concern underneath it as I explained the situation. She told me officers were on their way, but it would take time. Out here in the middle of nowhere, help was never quick. I crouched by the basement door, straining to listen. The men had reached the front porch. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard it, a sharp knock, knuckles rapping against the wood, too forceful to be polite. I held my breath, hoping they would think no one was home and leave. But that hope vanished when the sound of splintering wood filled the air. They had kicked the door in. The crack echoed through the house, rattling the walls. My hands tightened around the phone, gripping it like a lifeline as I whispered into it. "They're inside." The dispatcher's voice on the other end stayed calm, promising that officers were on their way. The footsteps started then, heavy and deliberate, moving through the house. Doors creaked open. Objects thudded as they were carelessly thrown aside. They weren't searching quietly. They wanted to be quick, efficient. I could hear cabinets slamming, the shuffle of drawers being emptied. They were looking for something. I stayed perfectly still. The sounds of their search grew louder. With every step they took, the distance between us seemed to shrink. I kept praying they wouldn't notice the basement door. Minutes passed like hours, each sound from above twisting my nerves tighter. I stayed crouched, one hand gripping my phone, the other braced against the cold basement floor. I could hear the men's voices faintly, muttered exchanges I couldn't make out. Then the footsteps moved toward the basement door. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. My breath was shallow, barely a whisper in the dark. I heard one of the men jostle the door handle, rattling it gently. My pulse surged as I pressed myself deeper into the shadows. But then the rattling stopped. A beat of silence followed, and then one of them grunted, "Let's go." Relief surged through me as their footsteps retreated, heavy boots thudding against the wooden floors. I stayed where I was, listening as they stomped back toward the front door. The house creaked under their weight. Finally, I heard the front door open again, the hinges groaning under the strain. They had left. Through the small basement window, I watched as the men walked back to the car. The tall one, still holding the gun, scanned the property one last time before climbing into the passenger seat. A moment later, the engine roared to life, and the car rolled down the driveway, disappearing into the evening twilight. Relief washed over me, though it was thin and fleeting. I stayed in the basement for a few minutes longer, waiting, making sure they were really gone. The silence felt thick and fragile, as if even the smallest noise might shatter it. Then faintly, I heard them, the distant wail of police sirens cutting through the countryside. My heart leapt with hope as a patrol car sped past my farm, chasing after the intruders. I stayed frozen, listening to the fading sirens as the pursuit moved further down the road. When the house was finally still and the sirens had faded into the distance, I allowed myself to move. My legs were stiff as I stood, my body aching from the tension. I unlocked the basement door and crept upstairs, the house feeling strangely unfamiliar in the quiet aftermath. The front door hung awkwardly on its hinges, splinters scattered across the floor where it had been kicked open. Drawers were pulled out, cabinets emptied, and the contents of my life lay scattered across the floor like debris after a storm. I learned later that the police had caught up with the car not far from the farm. The driver had lost control on a sharp bend, crashing into a ditch. The men survived the crash and were taken into custody, but no one could explain why they had come to my farm or what they had been looking for. I took the job because it seemed easy, caretaking for a small farm while the owner was away. Feed the animals, clean the stalls, and keep the place running. The isolation didn't bother me. In fact, it was part of the appeal. A few weeks away from everything, surrounded by open fields and quiet nights. The first couple of nights were peaceful. I slept well, lulled by the occasional rustling from the barn and the low murmur of cows shifting in their stalls. The farmhouse was old but cozy, and I settled into the rhythm quickly. Mornings spent feeding the animals, evenings with a book, and early nights under thick blankets. There was no reason to think anything would go wrong. It was just me, the animals, and the vast, empty fields stretching out under a pale sky. It seemed like the perfect escape. Then one night, I woke suddenly to a sound I couldn't explain. Heavy footsteps, right above my head, pacing across the roof. The steps were slow and deliberate, each one falling with a weight that didn't make sense. This wasn't a raccoon or a stray cat. It was something larger. I grabbed my flashlight and crept outside, the cold night air biting against my skin. I scanned the yard with the beam, expecting to see an animal, or maybe someone playing a prank. But the yard was empty. No footprints, no movement, just the eerie silence of the night. In the barn, the animals were restless, shifting uneasily in their pens. The cows snorted softly, and the sheep stamped their hooves. Even the chickens, normally noisy at night, were silent. They huddled together, feathers puffed, as if they sensed something I couldn't. I stood in the cold for a long moment, scanning the rooftop and the surrounding fields. But there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the farm and the distant rustle of wind through the trees. The next morning, I found something I hadn't noticed the night before: scratches along the eaves of the roof. Deep, jagged marks ran along the edges, as if something had tried to pull itself up onto the roof but hadn't quite made it. The chimney had similar grooves carved into the brick, long parallel lines that didn't look natural. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe an animal after all. But the sight of those marks left me uneasy. They weren't random scratches. They were deliberate. When I went to check on the animals, I made another unsettling discovery. 2 of the sheep were missing. Their stalls were empty, and there were no signs of struggle. No blood, no tracks leading away from the barn. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the day searching the property, walking the perimeter of the fields and checking the fences for holes. But I found nothing. The sheep were gone, and I couldn't explain how. That's when I decided to install cameras around the farmhouse and barn. Whatever was out there, I wanted to know what I was dealing with. For the next few nights, everything seemed normal. I checked the footage each morning, expecting to see something strange, but the cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary. The nights were quiet. The animals settled back into their routine, and I began to think maybe the disturbances had stopped, or that I'd imagined the whole thing. The sense of relief was short-lived, though. In the back of my mind, the missing sheep and the scratches on the roof nagged at me, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe the sheep had wandered off. Maybe the scratches were older than I thought. Then, late one night, everything changed. I was lying in bed when the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. The house was plunged into darkness, and the quiet hum of the refrigerator and heaters died away, leaving the air unnervingly still. I sat up, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. The only sound I could hear was the soft rustling of the animals in the barn, restless and uneasy again. And then I heard it, the footsteps. Not on the roof this time. They were outside, slow and heavy, circling the farmhouse just beyond the windows. I sat frozen in the dark, the flashlight gripped tight in my hand. Outside, the footsteps were deliberate, dragging across the dirt and gravel around the farmhouse. They didn't belong to anything natural. Each step was too heavy, too measured, as if whoever or whatever was out there was making sure I knew it was circling the house. I fought the urge to look out the window. Something inside me whispered that I wouldn't want to see what was out there. I stayed perfectly still, my pulse pounding in my ears, listening to the slow, deliberate rhythm of the footsteps moving from one side of the house to the other. They paused briefly, right by the front porch, as if whoever was out there was considering coming inside. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt the cold grip of fear spread through me. Then, without warning, the steps resumed, continuing their slow circuit around the farmhouse. The moments stretched painfully, every second feeling like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps stopped. I sat in the stillness, waiting, barely daring to breathe. Nothing followed, no knock, no crash, no attempt to break in, just the silence of the night swallowing everything whole again. When morning came, I ventured outside, feeling as though I had barely slept. The barn door groaned as I swung it open, and I immediately knew something was wrong. Another sheep was gone, vanished, just like the others. I searched the stalls and the surrounding fields, but once again, there were no signs of struggle, no broken fences, no footprints, just the eerie absence of an animal that had been there the night before. I checked the cameras, hands shaking as I scrolled through the footage, but there was nothing. Just static-filled darkness. The cameras had cut out the moment the lights went off, and by the time the power returned, everything looked perfectly normal, except for the missing sheep. That was it for me. Whatever was happening on this farm, it was beyond anything I wanted to understand. The missing sheep, the heavy footsteps, the scratches on the roof, I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't going to stop. And I didn't want to be around to find out what would happen next. I made the decision to leave as soon as the sun rose. There was no time to think it over. The thought of staying even one more night sent a cold wave of dread through me. Whatever had been out there, it had gotten closer. It had circled the house, tested the boundaries, and I knew that next time, it might not stop at the door. I packed in a rush, shoving my clothes and a few personal items into my bag. I didn't care about the pay or waiting for the owner to return. None of it mattered anymore. I had to leave, now. The animals were quiet as I moved through the barn, their eyes following me as I gathered my things. I didn't dare look out the windows as I grabbed my things from the house. The thought of catching a glimpse of something outside, something I couldn't explain, was too much. I locked the farmhouse door behind me out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't make a difference. As I drove away, the farmhouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror, a lonely silhouette against the open sky. The fields stretched out in every direction, empty and silent. For a moment, I felt the weight of the place lift off my shoulders. But it was fleeting, and in its place came a gnawing unease that stayed with me, settling in the pit of my stomach like a stone. At the edge of the property, I slowed the car and glanced back one last time. The farmhouse stood still and silent, the barn a dark shape beside it. The fields looked normal, empty, quiet. I drove away without looking back again, the road stretching endlessly before me. I don't know what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to find out. We've lived on this farm for as long as I can remember, my husband and I. It's not a grand place, just a patch of land with rolling fields and a simple house nestled beneath the trees. But it's ours, and for years it's been a peaceful life. The beauty of the farm draws people from time to time, especially in spring and summer, when the flowers bloom and the fields turn lush and green. We've always welcomed visitors, sharing the land's beauty with whoever takes an interest. That day seemed like any other. The sun was warm, the breeze gentle, and the sky was a bright, endless blue. I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the view, when they arrived, a girl and a boy, both polite, with eager smiles. They couldn't have been more than 17 or 18. They asked if they could walk around the farm and take some photos, and I saw no harm in it. My husband gave them a friendly wave from where he was working by the barn. We liked having people admire the place. It made all the hard work feel worth it. At first, everything seemed fine. They wandered the fields, taking pictures and laughing quietly between themselves. I went back inside, figuring they'd explore for an hour or so before heading off like most visitors do. But as the day wore on, I began to feel unsettled. They hadn't left. The afternoon dragged on, and the sun dipped lower in the sky. I glanced out the window and saw the two of them still there, walking near the far fence, taking their time like they had nowhere else to be. Most visitors don't linger that long, especially without saying goodbye or thanking us. The light had started to shift, casting long shadows across the fields. Something about the way the boy stood, his shoulders squared, his posture stiff, made me uneasy. I watched as my husband dusted off his hands and headed toward them. It was getting late, and he meant to remind them that it was time to go. From where I stood in the house, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see my husband's calm, familiar gestures, hands in his pockets, nodding politely. But the boy didn't seem to like what he was hearing. His stance grew rigid, and though I couldn't make out the words, I knew the conversation wasn't going well. My chest tightened with unease. I stayed by the window, watching as my husband spoke to the young couple. The girl stood slightly behind the boy, her face unreadable, while the boy's expression hardened. My husband repeated himself. I could tell by the way his hands moved. He wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice or lose his temper. But the boy didn't like being told what to do. I saw him step closer, squaring his shoulders, and then, without warning, he shoved my husband hard. My heart stopped as I watched him fall. He hit the ground awkwardly, his head striking the hard soil with a sickening thud. For a moment, everything seemed to slow. My husband lay still, not moving, and the boy just stood there, looming over him. Panic surged through me, cold and sharp. I wanted to scream, to run to him, but something about the boy's posture, how easily he had turned violent, froze me in place. My hands shook as I clutched the edge of the windowsill. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to do something, but fear held me back. Without thinking, I turned and ran toward the house, my heart racing. The screen door banged shut behind me as I locked it, fumbling with the latch. My hands trembled uncontrollably, my thoughts spinning wildly. My husband was lying out there, unconscious or worse, and I didn't know what those two would do next. I grabbed the phone and dialed for an ambulance. My voice shook as I explained what had happened, my words coming out in a rush. "Please, hurry," I begged the dispatcher, glancing nervously out the window. After hanging up, I tried calling the police, but when I looked at the phone's screen, there was no signal. My heart sank. I was completely cut off. I crouched by the window, peeking out from behind the curtain. The boy and girl were standing over my husband, talking quietly to each other, as if nothing had happened. Then, without another glance in his direction, they turned and walked toward the fence at the edge of the field. They didn't run. They didn't even seem concerned. They just left, slipping through the fence like shadows, disappearing into the twilight. I stayed by the window, heart pounding as I watched the field where the two figures had disappeared. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. I felt trapped in that moment, helpless and unsure if I should leave the house or stay inside, hoping the ambulance would arrive before it was too late. I kept trying the phone, desperate to get a signal, but it was useless. Every attempt only reminded me how alone I was out here, with my husband lying unconscious outside. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if they came back? What if they weren't finished with us? The moments dragged on painfully, each second stretching into what felt like an eternity. I knew I had to check on my husband, but fear rooted me to the spot. My hands shook as I gripped the phone, clinging to it as if it could somehow protect me from whatever might still be lurking outside. Finally, the distant hum of tires on gravel broke the crushing silence. I nearly collapsed with relief as the ambulance pulled into the driveway, its lights flashing, cutting through the dimming twilight. I rushed outside, waving the paramedics toward my husband. They found him lying where he had fallen, his breathing shallow but steady. One of them knelt beside him, checking his pulse and gently lifting his head to examine the wound. "He's alive," the paramedic said softly, and those words felt like a lifeline, pulling me back from the edge of panic. While they worked to stabilize him, I told them everything. How the two young people had arrived earlier, how they had seemed polite at first, and then how everything had spiraled into violence. My voice trembled as I recounted the moment the boy shoved my husband, the way they lingered afterward, indifferent to what they'd done. I stayed by my husband's side all the way to the hospital. The hours felt like a blur. Nurses, doctors, beeping machines, none of it fully registering in my mind. All I could focus on was the rise and fall of my husband's chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing as they treated him for a concussion. The police came while we were waiting in the emergency room. I told them everything, giving them every detail I could remember. The young man's angry stance, the girl's detached expression, the way they had walked away so casually, as if what they had done didn't matter. The officers took down my statement and promised to investigate. They reassured me that they would do their best to find the two of them. But even as they said the words, I could see the doubt in their eyes. We went back to the farm, hoping to return to our old life, but things had changed. The police never found the young couple. No leads, no traces, nothing to explain why they had come, or what had driven them to attack my husband so suddenly. Even now, I catch myself glancing at the road, watching for unfamiliar cars or visitors who might wander too close. We still live here. The farm is as beautiful as ever, but it feels different now. I've learned that not everyone who comes through is looking to admire the land. Some come with intentions we'll never understand.